name is Brian Lander, and I'm going to speak today on small-scale water control works in early China. Before I begin, I would just like to thank you for inviting me to speak today. Because this event is in Korea, I decided to submit a paper in Chinese and then give my talk in English so that more people will understand what I'm saying. 如果你们不懂英文的话，我的文章是用中文写的，所以你们可以看那个。我是用英文，因为我想应该有一些人不太懂中文。So, East Asia has some of the best historical records in the world of the ways that people have transformed their water systems. However, some of these historical records, especially the earliest ones, were written by central government officials, and therefore they mostly discuss very large water scale projects, which leaves us with very little idea of the smaller scale water control systems that were far more common than the big ones. Fortunately, China's construction boom of the past few decades has led to the discovery of dozens of different caches of ancient documents, and several of these provide important new insights into water control. So today I will combine information from received sources and from excavated sources to discuss what we know about smaller, medium and small scale water control works in early China. Most of the excavated documents that have been discovered were buried in tombs, in particular in the tombs of local officials who were presumably buried with official documents such as legal statutes in order to demonstrate their status as officials in the afterlife. Several of these documents include information on the administration of water systems. Beyond legal statutes, there are also two more important finds of routine documents from water administration. First of all, fragmentary texts purchased by the Chinese University of Hong Kong, CUHK, are the records of repairs of small irrigation reservoirs, river dikes in the central Yangtze Basin. While those the Three Kingdoms era documents from Domalo in Changsha concern the repairs of small irrigation reservoirs. Although most of the excavated documents were discovered in the central Yangtze Basin, we know that these types of water control systems were built all across the Qin and Han empires. The only reason most of the documents come from the central Yangtze region is because the water table is high, so there's low oxygen, and the documents were preserved in that situation. One of the interesting things about these documents is that they reveal that some of the received documents, documents that were passed down since antiquity, are more accurate than we may have thought. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but essentially because these excavated documents can tell us what the situation was in the early imperial period, we can now go back to the received documents, such as the Guanzi, and use them again to think about what types of water system must have existed. And I'm not going to talk about it very much today, but I should also add that archaeologists have discovered actual remnants of water control systems. The most famous of these, of course, is the one at Liangzhu, near Hangzhou in Zhejiang, where archaeologists have discovered a large water control system of the Bronze Age, not the Bronze Age, of the Neolithic. And then also in both the capital of the Western Zhou, in Fenghao near Xi'an, and also the Qin capital near, Yong, it's near Baoji, have water control works that were built around the capital. So even though I'm not going to talk very much about these, I should note that archaeologists are not only discovering written evidence of water control, but also archaeological evidence. Now, as many people in East Asia know, the most important early historical documents that contain any information on water control are the Shiji and the Hanshu, both of which contain essays that are specifically on water control. And this is very important because water control is not something that most ancient civilizations chose to discuss on its own. So this is a peculiarity of early Chinese civilization. Now, as I said before, these are mostly concerned about large-scale water control works. And in fact, Sima Qian acknowledges this because he talks about how Han Wudi and his officials closed the breach in the Yellow River. And then he talks about many other projects that were built after that time. And then he says that the other small channels and waterways cut through the mountains were too numerous to mention. What he means is that there were many, many small-scale water control systems put in place at this time, and he's not going to talk about them. So today, what I'm interested in is, in particular, with the systems that the texts like the Shiji and the Hanshu do not discuss. It's not clear to us now how common smaller-scale water control works were in early China. In the north, in the Yellow River Valley, the main crops were drought-tolerant millets, which didn't require too much rain, and therefore agriculture remained relatively extensive and relied on large areas of relatively low productivity, rather than the intensive and high-product agriculture of more recent times. In the south, much of the best rice land flooded naturally in the spring and summer, and it's possible that many rice farmers took advantage of this to practice agriculture that had low yields but required little labor. Unfortunately, we know almost nothing about farming in China during the Qin in South China during the Qin and Han periods, because most of the documents were written in the north. There's no doubt that the population growth in the Yangtze over the most recent millennium, I mean, since the Song dynasty, has resulted in these familiar rice paddies of modern times, which are very dense, very small, and where farmers put a lot of effort into them. But in ancient times, the population of the Yangtze Valley was very low. So it is not, we should not assume that rice cultivation was very labor intensive. It might have also been very extensive. Nonetheless, it is natural for people growing rice to modify the water systems of their fields, at least by building ditches and so on. And we know that they were doing this because of the Neolithic site of Changtoshan near Lixian in Hunan. So the most important thing for understanding water control in China is that, well, everywhere in East Asia, is that most of the rain falls in the summer, and sometimes it falls in very heavy rainfalls. And what this means is that there's a very strong risk of flooding at the time when people have planted their crops. And therefore, in many different areas, people need to build dikes along the sides of rivers to prevent the water from flooding. In the Guanzi collection, there is a chapter called Du Di, and it contains some detailed descriptions of how people should organize floods. For example, Guanzhong. So first I should say this text probably was written in the Qin or Han, early Han period, maybe slightly earlier. It's definitely not from the Chunqiu period, from the spring and autumn period, even though that's when Guanzhong lived. It's essentially a fictional dialogue. So Guanzhong divides waterways into different categories and then discusses water control problems like how currents erode banks at curves and waterways, and how silt deposition changes water currents. In order to keep waterways under control, he recommends creating a water administration headed by men who are familiar with water management and provide them with staff. He advises appointing a man in each area to inspect waterways, dikes, reservoirs, and other infrastructure, and to ensure that laborers are mobilized to work on them. He then instructs these officials to keep track of the local population, to keep track of how many people there are who can actually work, in order to make sure that when they need people to repair the dikes, either for routine administration or during emergencies, that they actually have enough people to do it. And as we will see below, this again, that labor and the number of workers it will take to do these projects is one of the key things that that officials are always interested in. One of the most interesting passages from the Du Di chapter of the Guanzi says, Guanzhong recommends regularly ordering officials of the Water Bureau to maintain dikes during the winter. Those that can be repaired should be noted and reported to the regional government, which will deal with them during the spring lull in farming. Once it has been completed, the dike should be regularly inspected, and if there are breaks or there are heavy rains, then each administrative region should take care of its own sectors. And each place that can be repaired should be repaired quickly. During heavy rains, employ conscript labor. So until these more recently excavated documents were discovered, we might have imagined that this was not the real administrative system of the early imperial China, that it was in fact just the imagination of somebody who wished that they had such an effective system. But in fact, it seems like this is a very good description of the system that actually existed in the Qin and Han. So now let's move on to some excavated documents. So some of the best evidence we have that this type of water control was very common come from the laws of the Qin and the Han Empire. For example, a Qin statute from the Warring States period, excavated at Haojiaping in Sichuan, instructs officials to have reservoirs, dikes, bridges, and fords repaired in the 10th month of every year. The same legal statute was then copied into the early Han laws that were discovered at Zhangjiashan in Hubei. And this is interesting because texts like the Yueling, which is found in the Liji and other places, also, and several other texts also say that repairing dikes is one of the things that officials should do every year. So this gives us the picture that local officials knew that keeping track of infrastructure, not only dikes, but also bridges and waterways and irrigation systems was part of their job. Now, there are two other legal documents that we know exist, but which have not been published very well. One of them comes from the Hujia site in Hubei, in Jingzhou. And all we know about it is that there is a Zhishui Lü, which is a statute on controlling water. And then the also early Han documents excavated from the tomb number 77 at Shuihudi also contains passages about managing canals, dikes, and sluices, about what to do when floods destroy houses and fields, and not to mention roads, bridges, and dikes, when canals break, and also to do with irrigation. So unfortunately, this document has not been published. Neither of these two documents have been published. But essentially, at some point, hopefully soon, we will actually be able to see the statutes from the early Han period on controlling water. The one from Shuihudi is close enough to the Guanzi system from Dudi that it suggests that we do have some idea that the Dudi system actually existed in practice. So laws are very important because they tell us what officials around the empire were being told to do, but they do not tell us whether people actually followed these laws. Fortunately, we have two different documents discovered that give us a better idea of how these things actually worked in practice. The first ones of these are the documents from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. These are actual records of how the Han government surveyed broken dikes along rivers to plan how to repair and maintain them. Unfortunately, these documents were stolen from a tomb, so we don't know exactly where they came from, but Peng Hao has written a nice article about them, and he showed that they came from essentially the 1st century of the Han dynasty, around the same time as the two legal statutes that we mentioned about. They were written in the central Yangtze Basin in the modern provinces of Hubei and Hunan. And this is a place that is entirely flat and is very prone to flooding. And therefore, that explains why this area needs dikes. These documents were produced by Han government officials to calculate how much labor would be required to repair the dikes, and then calculate how much arable land would be produced by repairing the dikes. There are only 24 pieces of wood, and many of these are fragmentary. So these are not a very large body of documents, but some of them are some of them are complete at least. For example, the one I cite in the paper, in translation it reads, the South District Yihe dikes are altogether 13 li and 130 bu in length. Their area is 25,000 bu. calculating at the rate of 6 1/3 bu wide, the area is 25,490 bu squared, and the discrepancy is lower than the actual area by 490 bu difference from the rate. Now this is very complicated. The point being here that the document is essentially the record of officials who went out to a dike to look at it and see whether it measured with the measurements they already had in place. So just to provide a little more background knowledge, early Chinese empires controlled enormous amounts of unpaid labor because most adults had to do corvée labor, also known as statute labor, and because most crimes were punished with labor sentences. In order to manage all these workers, the Qin and Han governments employed a standardized system of labor units, such as that described above, related to the amount of earth moved. When the document says calculating at the rate of 6 1/3 bu wide, what it means is that a previous administrator had measured the average width of these dikes, and these officials had come back and decided whether that 6 1/3 bu was correct. And the reason they do this is because they need to decide how much earth there is in this dike, so that when they send workers to fix it, they will be able to decide how many of those workers will be required for each section of the dike. So they'll take a certain number of workers and say, your job for today is to repair this section, and your job is to repair this section. And so they needed to have a good idea how much work it would take to fix it. Now, the main goal here was to repair broken dikes in order to create farmland. This is clear from the text of the one larger document, number 222, which reads, the Yichang dikes are altogether 323 li, 26 bu. Their area is 719,618 square bu. Altogether, the dikes that can be managed equal 921 li, 240 bu, and the area is 3,181,812 square bu. I won't read the whole thing, but the point being that they are telling you how many of the dikes that they measured are possible, can be fixed, how many of them cannot be fixed. And then they say how much land will be created if they are fixed, how many fields for farming will be created, and how many people will be able to get farms from this. And so that is the main point here. We don't know exactly where we know Yichang and Liang, we know the locations of, but many of the other smaller place names, we don't really know. Yichang is actually still called Yichang in Hubei, and Liang is near Lixian in Hunan. And they're about 120 kilometers apart direct, which means that these were probably the documents of the Nanjun, the Nan Commandery. And they were a central official of that commandery trying to do a survey of the whole commandery. The other texts, which I won't discuss in much depth because Ling Wenchao is going to talk about them, are the routine administrative works from excavated at Zomalo, which is in Changsha. These are interesting because they are also about officials going to look at damaged water control works and to decide if they were fixed, if they could be fixed. So the documents from the Chinese University of Hong Kong collection were probably measuring dikes that had been damaged during the war, during the fall of the Qin Empire and the founding of the Han Empire. And so the Han Empire had come back into power and was going out and trying to fix these systems so they could increase the amount of arable land and increase its tax revenue. As for Zomalo, this was right after the wars of the fall of the Han Empire, the famous Three Kingdoms Wars, many of which were in this region. For example, Chibi, the Red Cliffs are not far from Hunan. So there were very large-scale wars here, and many of the water control systems had been broken down, and the Sun Wu government was trying to figure out if they could fix them. And so instead of being river dikes, the documents from Zomalo are probably small reservoirs that were being built to collect rainwater so that they could irrigate their rice fields. And as I said, I talk about this more in the paper, so you can see it for more details, but since Ling Wenchao will be speaking later, I will leave the details of this to him. One thing I would add is that the Yuezhuo, which is a Han Dynasty text, also talks about these types of tang or po or pi in the lower Yangtze region, essentially in Jiangsu, maybe Zhejiang. So we can guess that these types of systems existed in the south. And then many of the traditional texts are talking about North China, which means that these types of documents existed all over, these types of water control systems, such as dikes, irrigation systems, existed all over the Qin and Han empires. And although we do not know how widespread they were, one thing that we can say for sure is that they were much more widespread than we would have guessed from the Shiji and Hanshu accounts. And we can now start to get more and more idea of what this actually looked like on the ground. So that is all I have to say now. There's still many mysteries that we do not understand about this, but I think these documents have really opened up a new field of studying different scales of water control than we had before. Thank you very much.